The first weeks after you realize you can't remember learning to wait are unsettling in a way that has no vocabulary. Not the romantic waiting of delayed gratification or patience as virtue, but the structural fact of time passing without stimulation being a category error. You remember the afternoon light in rooms where nothing was happening and no one thought to remedy that. Not boredom exactly, the absence of the concept that something should always be available to occupy the gap between one thing and the next. This produces a strange double vision when you notice others cannot tolerate silence in a car or an empty hand without a device. Not as weakness, but as a genuinely different neurological baseline about what constitutes normal consciousness. What registers first is always misdiagnosed as nostalgia or superiority, neither of which survives scrutiny. The initial observation that you operate differently in information environments feels like discovering you have better posture than others, a small genetic luck, but the mechanism underneath is not about quality. It is about the fundamentally different relationship to ephemerality. When information could disappear and frequently did, when you could not resurface a half-remembered song or verify a disputed fact or retrieve the name of that actor in that thing, the mind developed a different archival system. Not better memory, but a different encoding priority. What mattered was decided in real time and committed or released permanently. The psychological weight of that unretrievability is not something you can convey to someone who has never experienced it as default. They think you are talking about inconvenience. You are talking about a selection pressure that shaped what you considered worth keeping in the first place. The second wave of misunderstanding comes from the explanations you try to give yourself. You might decide it made you more present, more capable of depth, better at sustained attention. These are the stories that feel true because they are partially true, but they obscure the actual mechanism. The depth was not cultivated as a value. It was the only option in a landscape where nothing was cross-referenced, where you could not tab away, where the thing in front of you was all there was, and you either entered it completely or you sat there doing nothing. This is not discipline. This is environmental determinism. The habit of finishing books you hated because you brought only one on a trip and there was nothing else. The way you learned an album in sequence because shuffle did not exist and you could not skip without physical effort. These were not choices that built character. They were constraints that built neural pathways, and the pathways remain even when the constraints have dissolved. What becomes visible after the false explanations exhaust themselves is that you are pattern matching across a time frame others do not have access to. You watch the internet arrive in stages. You have a before and during and after that people 5 years younger do not possess in the same way, and people 5 years older possess differently. This is not about memory. This is about having observed the transition in your own behavior and therefore being able to see the seams in a way natives to either era cannot. You notice when someone has never experienced the specific anxiety of being unreachable and how that produces a different tolerance for obligation. You notice when someone has never had to choose between two pieces of information because they could not have both and how that produces a different relationship to decision closure. You notice when someone has never sustained a friendship through letters that took a week to arrive, and how that produces a different assumption about what responsiveness signals. These observations do not make you better. They make you aware of variables others do not know are variables. The inversion arrives when you realize the traits you thought were strengths are also deficits that have no remedy. You can focus deeply, but you are slow to context switch in ways that are punished in the current information economy. You can sit with ambiguity, because you are used to never knowing, but this reads as indecisiveness in environments that reward fast convergence on good enough answers. You can be alone without distress, but you miss the moment when everyone else has moved on, because you were not monitoring the feed. You are decent at research because you remember when research was hard, but you over-research because you do not trust the accessibility of information even though it is now infinitely accessible. The same mechanisms that gave you certain capabilities have left you maladapted in adjacent domains. You are running software built for different hardware constraints, and there is no update that will resolve this, because the formative period is closed. The hidden costs only become apparent when you try to reverse engineer what you lost by spending your adolescence in a low-information environment. You did not develop the reflex to document the self because there was no platform demanding it. This means you have a weak autobiographical record and a weaker skill at self-narration in digestible formats. You did not learn to manage ambient social surveillance, so you are clumsy in environments where performance is constant and expected. You did not build identity through feedback loops with an audience, so your sense of self is less flexible, more monolithic, harder to update. You aged into adulthood, believing privacy was default and publicity was the exception, which leaves you instinctively resistant to things others consider normal transparency. You cannot recover the years when you could have been building a different relationship to visibility. The brain plasticity required to naturalize that mode has narrowed. You can learn the behaviors, but they will always be translations, not native cognition. What you have instead is a structural comfort with your own company that people mistake for introversion, but is actually something more specific. You do not need external input to regulate your nervous system because you were raised in an environment where external input was sparse and unpredictable. You can tolerate long stretches of unstimulated time because your reward circuitry was not trained to expect continuous novelty. You can pursue projects in private for years without external validation because you did not grow up with metrics that quantified interest in real time. This is an advantage only in specific contexts. It makes you good at work that requires isolation and delay. It makes you bad at work that requires constant networking and visibility. It means you are likely to under-promote yourself because you have no instinct for the kind of self-presentation that algorithms reward. You will watch people younger than you build audiences by understanding mechanisms you find faintly repulsive. And you will not be able to fully articulate why, except that it feels like a category error to treat attention as a resource to extract rather than a gift occasionally given. The social consequences compound silently. You do not have the same relationship to outrage because you remember when you could not know what strangers thought about anything. And this makes you slower to react to the thing everyone is reacting to, which means by the time you form a position, the moment has passed. You do not have the same relationship to urgency because you lived in a world where most things were not urgent and turned out fine anyway. You do not have the same relationship to consensus because you spent your formative years in smaller pools where you could know the people you were disagreeing with. And this makes you keep trying to understand the individual when the game has moved to coalitional signaling. You come across as politically disengaged or insufficiently loyal, when really you are operating on a different protocol about how beliefs form and when they should be made public. You still think positions should be stable and considered. The environment now rewards fast-shifting signaling and high-frequency updates. You are legible to a small number of people who share this timing, and increasingly illegible to everyone else. What solidifies slowly is the recognition that you cannot teach this, and you cannot return to it, and people who want it cannot acquire it after the fact. The window closed. Someone who is 25 now and wishes they had grown up without the internet is wishing for something that is not actually available to them even if they delete their accounts and go live in the woods. The neural architecture is already built. The expectations are set. The comparisons to others who have maintained connectivity will poison the experiment. They will feel like they are missing out because they will be missing out. The value of having grown up without it was never in the absence itself, but in the fact that the absence was universal and unquestioned. You were not opting out. There was nothing to opt out of. This produced a different psychological baseline that cannot be reconstructed through willpower or nostalgia. You have something they do not have, and they have something you do not have, and neither can be transferred. The resolution is not synthesis. You do not become someone who bridges both worlds. You remain slightly out of phase. You notice you are most comfortable with people within a 5-year age band who had a similar transition curve. You notice you have less to say to people who are much younger because the reference do not line up, and you are tired of explaining things that sound like you are just complaining about change. You notice you have less to say to people who are older because they did not have the experience of watching the change in themselves, only around themselves. You find yourself in a narrow cohort that shares a particular kind of double vision, and you stop trying to articulate it to people outside that cohort, because the effort is not worth the misunderstanding. You accept that you have a specific kind of cognitive equipment that was built by accident of timing, and that it makes you good at certain things and bad at certain things, and the future will increasingly reward the things you are bad at. You do not fight this. You find the pockets where what you have is useful, and you stay there. You stop thinking something is wrong with you when you cannot keep up with the pace of platform shifts. You stop thinking something is wrong with them when they cannot sit still. You just notice the difference, and you orient accordingly.